This is Lecture 9, Sensation and Perception, covering the visual system, and this corresponds to Chapter 9 from your textbook.
So just some basic information about sensation and perception. Sensory neurons code stimuli from the outside, from the environment, into patterns of action potentials. And sensory information is then interpreted within the brain. And we hope that it's pretty close to the actual environment, but it's often like a mismatch from the actual environment. So we know through optical illusions that a lot of times what we think we see is not what we actually see. We know this from hallucinations as well. Hallucinations are associated with mental illness, but actually some form of hallucination, either visual or auditory, occurs in about 40% of the population. So 40% of the population has had some kind of false perception that would count as a minor hallucination at some point in their life. And then expectations for what we're going to be perceiving also affects the interpretation of sensation. So sensory receptors transduce or convert sensory stimuli into neural activity. And sensory receptors are tuned to specific stimuli. So the visual system is tuned to light. The sensory receptors in the eyes, which are photoreceptors, are tuned to pick up on light, right? They're not tuned to pick up on sound. In the auditory system, waves of air pressure, which is what sound is, creates vibrations that physically stimulate hair cells, which are nerve cells in the ear, and then this is transduced or converted into neural signals. In the somatosensory system, which is responsible for touch and balance, physical stimulation on the skin and within the body is transduced into neural signals. And then in the gustatory and olfactory systems, chemical molecules in food and air bind actually directly to receptors in the nose and tongue and then create neural signals from there. Each animal has sensory receptors that have evolved for their needs. So as humans, our sensory receptors are tuned to our specific needs. Other animals have different sensory receptors and different sensory abilities that are tuned to their needs. So for example, bees can see in ultraviolet light. And this is an example. So bees can't see red, I think. What we perceive as red, bees do not perceive as red. So what we perceive as yellow, they actually perceive as red. But they can also see in this wavelength of light beyond violet, which is called ultraviolet, and this helps them find the tastiest part of the flowers and the tastiest flowers. A receptive field is a specific region of the world, which is like a set of stimuli in the world that stimulates a given receptor cell or neuron. So photoreceptor neurons, which pick up on light in the eye, code for specific spatial regions in the field of vision. And if you look at this image on the top right, these little circles, these yellow circles, each sort of represents what a different photoreceptor cell in the brain might code for. So each cell in the brain has like a specific spatial region in your sight that it codes for. And the receptor fields are actually quite a bit smaller than that, but this is just kind of a demonstration of that concept. When we move, the brain is actually performing rather complex functions to keep our perception of the outside world stable while there's so much changing information in our visual field. So movement, keeping a stable concept in the environment while moving, is actually rather complicated neural process. So maybe if you've ever been sitting on one train and another train leaves, this can probably happen in like a car or a bus as well. But you're sitting in a train and the train next to you leaves, starts moving forward, you might start feeling like you're moving backward. And this is just one example of the visual system kind of being tricked and the complexity of making us, keeping us perceiving the world as it is, as opposed to incorrectly perceiving the world. Kind of interesting, birds don't have as complex of an ability to count for movement in their visual field, and this is one of the reasons they bob their head when they're walking. So if you see like pigeons walking and they bob their head back and forth, this is actually a way of keeping objects in their visual field stable while moving. So if they're walking it would just be a constantly moving picture, and their tiny little bird brains can't account for that. So they move their head back and forth to just keep part of their visual field stable for a little bit. So they're more likely to see little pieces of food on the street. This is a fun illusion related to receptive fields. It's called the floating finger illusion. So you can hold your hands in front of your eyes with the tips of your pointer fingers touching. So maybe hold your hand like 6 inches from your eyes, maybe even less, maybe like 4. And then focus your eyes on the distance, not your fingers. And you should see a disconnected, like floating finger or floating sausage between your index fingers. And this is due to the overlapping receptive fields in the left and right retinas. So left and right eyes have different receptive fields, but they do overlap. And that's what this illusion is picking up on. And we'll talk a little bit more about receptive fields of the visual system later. Neural relays. So all sensory receptors connect to the neocortex through 3 or 4 other neurons. They kind of have to, it's not just axon to cortex. They have to connect to a couple other brain areas and therefore a few other neurons, which are interneurons. If you remember, interneurons connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. Information is modified at each of these connections based on other inputs from the brain. So the areas that the sensory receptors are going through are also getting receptors and also getting information from the neocortex, for example. And also there's just existing features of these areas that change the information coming in from the connecting neuron. It's sort of like a relay race of information, allowing for the contextualization and more efficient processing of incoming sensory information. It's kind of like if you've ever played that game like Telephone, where people stand in a row and one says a word or says a sentence to the person next to them, who says it to the person next to them, and you have to say it quietly, so it gets changed slightly each time. And then it gets to the final person, and you compare what the first person and the final person said. And the brain is kind of like that, except in Telephone, the joke is kind of that it's so different, like it's been misinterpreted all along the way. But in the brain, this is actually a good process. It's efficient, and it kind of fits information into our pre-existing structures for information. Okay, sensory systems are processed somewhat independently in primary sensory areas. So there's an auditory sensory area, primary visual area. So they're processed from their sensory organs somewhat independently and then combined in the cortex or integrated in higher level cortices. You might have heard of synesthesia, which is when one sensory system is stimulated and this results in the direct experience of another sensory modality or another cognitive process. So there are people who have synesthesia. I think it's actually a pretty big percentage, like maybe 4% of the population has some form of synesthesia, where, for example, some people will perceive different, like a number as being a different color. So they'll say like 2 is purple and 5 is red, something like this. Or if you look up at the top, if 7 is yellow and 9 is blue, and you ask them, oh, this picture looks a little wrong actually. 5 plus 2 is yellow, and yellow and 7 will be kind of like synonymous with them. They might see yellow in their head when they think of 7. And this synesthesia is associated with creativity. It's also associated with better memory, because if you're encoding information in multiple sensory modalities, in auditory and visual, there's a better chance that you're going to remember it. Ideesthesia is another phenomenon where some ideas evoke perception-like experiences. So an example of this is experimenters gave people these 2 shapes to the right, this kind of spiky shape and this blobby shape, and they asked which of the shapes is Kiki, which would you name Kiki, and which of these shapes would you name Booba. And about 95 to 85% of the people chose the same shape for Kiki and Booba. So decide for yourself which one you think is Kiki and which is Booba. And if you agree with about 95 to 98% of people, Kiki would be the spiky one, and Buba would be the more curvy one. And this effect is even seen, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, in children who are too young to read. So this is not just a matter of associating the shape of the word, the shape of the written word, with the shape. It's something more about this connection that we make between sound and images. Okay, just some general terminology. Perception is the subjective interpretation of sensation by the brain. So perception is subjective, and sensation is just the basic registration of physical stimuli that comes from the environment, from the sensory organs. So for example, tasting something, when you taste something, the sensation is just, sweet candy on your tongue, and the perception is, this candy is sweet. I'm experiencing this candy as sweet. And then topographical map is something we're going to talk about intermittently throughout the rest of the chapters. And this is spatially organized neural representation of the outside world. So this means that topographical map is when the cortex in the brain is kind of physically maps onto how things are in the real world. And this is an example. So in the sensory and the motor system, there's something called the homunculus, which means the sensory areas, the part of the cortex, of the sensory cortex, for example, that codes for lips is close to the nose, which is close to the eyes. And these are close on our physical face. They're also close on the cortex, for example.